Coming up in this video, I'll show you how I painted Crawlocke The Jailor for the Nighthaunt faction of Age of Sigmar. Hey guys, welcome back to Mini Junkie. My name is Jarrett. So before we get into the painting, I have one little complaint, and it's that with this model, Games Workshop changed its standard approach to how it names models and units and stuff in their online store for, as far as I can tell, the first time in decades. Or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but usually when they give a model a name like Crawlocke the Jailor, it's a named character in the rules. In this case, it's just a spirit torment, which I did not know when I ordered it because I hadn't read the rulebook yet and stuff like that. So I find that really weird. I don't understand why this wasn't just called Spirit Torment and Chain Gas as far as the box goes. But okay, I bet you anything this is a marketing experiment. It's a really cool model. I'll just forget that I actually already got a Spirit Torment also in the starter box. And without more preamble here, I'll show you how I painted this guy. It's actually pretty easy. Alright guys, as always, here's a few shots of the finished model that we're going for. As you can see, he's one of the rare Nighthaunts that doesn't have a cloak over top of his ethereal bit. So with that in mind, I ended up deciding to prime him white. First color I'm applying is P3 Eldritch. It's a new color. I'm adding airbrush flow improver because it's not meant to airbrush right out of the bottle. And I'm just going to spray that all over the ethereal portion of him, which includes spraying it up underneath the metal cage that he has on his back. Then I decided to airbrush some Sybarite Green from GW between, well, sort of at the ends of the Eldritch portions, and as they're going to blend into the gray, Ulthuan gray of the tendrils of ethereal stuff. So I decided to create a transition with the Sybarite, although honestly it's really subtle and you could get away with skipping it. Also optional is taking some black primer and going back over anywhere where I was going to paint some metals, so the cage on the ground, the metal bars on that thing on the ground, whatever that is, and then spraying black on the chain and on the lock and the keys. Now I'm using Ulthuan Gray airbrushed along the ends of the tendrils, like I said, blending into the either Sybarite Green or Eldritch Green, depending on what you chose. I don't use pure white here. I think the GW recommendation of Ulthuan Gray looks a little more smoky and ghostly, and is the right choice. Unlike with the chain rasps in the previous video, I decided to paint his arms underbelly blue, and from now on any of these Nighthaunts I do, I'm going to paint any of their body portions with this color first. Here I'm using old copper from scale 75 to paint things like the keys, part of the lock hanging from his chain there, and you'll see a few other spots, maybe that manacle he's wearing. And you could use, I think one's called Fulgurite copper for GW. Any copper paint would be just fine for this option, for this step. When those are dry, I'm going to come back with Nylock Oxide right out of the pot. I'm just going to brush it on to any of the copper areas I just painted. And the way I use it is I tend to basically cover the whole thing and then wipe it off with my finger across the surface area, or like the highest surface of the sculpt, and that kind of helps it to be just so that it's just sitting in the recesses of the sculpt. Now I'm just going to use gunmetal gray and paint in all of the bars of cages, things like maybe the chain, the cage thing that's across his back. All these areas are going to get this gunmetal gray, which is something you could be substituting lead belcher, for example. If this is any medium toned silver color would be fine for this step, any that you like. Scale 75 decayed metal was the choice for well, was the choice. So I chose to use that for the helmet because I want his head and sort of that mask thing he's wearing to stand apart and be different metal from the rest of the sculpt. So things like the cage on his back and the keys and everything, I wanted them to be a different tone. So here I'm using this, and this is kind of a dark bronzy color. You could probably use like molten bronze, something like that. But really any color you like is fine. Just pick a darkish brown metallic that you like and use it here. When that's dry, I decided to highlight it using Scale 75 Moonstone Alchemy. So the Scale 75 metallics come in a set that also includes these alchemy colors that are a metallic, usually light colors or primary colors that let you change the tint and tone of the main metallics you're using. So in this case, because that moonstone is it's a bright goldish color, that lightens this decayed metal, and I was able to create some highlights with it. I did the same thing for another step using white alchemy, same deal, added it to the mix I just created previously and further highlighted his mask, and going for like a bit more of a shine on the upper sort of forehead and lower face area. Next step, grab a silver. I use Runefang steel, any bright metal is fine. I took a small, I think they don't necessarily make these anymore, these small GW dry brush, but any rough brush you want, it can be used to apply a bit of a highlight to the chains and to the cage beams or whatever on his back and on the thing on the base and whatnot. So you're just highlighting up from that gunmetal we used before. Next step is interesting. I take Vallejo Model Wash Rust, and I've used this before. It's kind of neat stuff where it does stain. Like I painted over pretty much all the surface that I want to look old and decayed and rusty looking. But what happens is it tends to dry. Once it dries, the level of coloration it's creating fades away quite a bit, depending upon how much you're using, how many steps you use. So the very first application is going to be very subtle when it dries, and so that's where you can experiment. You can add a second coat, you can add, as you'll see, I'm going to add a dark rust. While that first rust wash is drying, I decided to add a bit more definition and shading to his face helmet thing. So I grabbed Agrax Earth Shade, painting it in behind the mask and then in sort of like the hollowed out cheek areas. Super basic step here. I took Mechanicus Standard Gray and I paint the rocks around that base decoration. I think I missed a step here because I'm going in and highlighting underbelly blue over what should be underbelly blue on his arms, but there's a step where after the first base coat of underbelly blue you should apply an all-over wash of Nylock Oxide to give it that ethereal bluish glow, and then once that's dry, do the highlight. Okay, so here I'm coming in with that dark rust, and I'm actually just blotting it into little pools where you might see a little bit more rust accumulate. So that's where a beam of metal meets a beam of metal, or some of the spots on the chain. Basically anywhere you might see a little more rust, I blot it on there, and once that'll dry and it'll sort of evaporate such that it'll it'll conform to the shape of the sculpt. It won't create like a big blob or anything like that. Extremely optional step. I wash any stone on my Nighthaunts. I wash with Athonian Camo Shade before I do any dry brush highlights of it, because I like creating that mossy greenish, old looking effect that the Athonian camo shade adds to it. Very, very optional step though, and very subtle. Almost can't even tell half the time. One of my pet peeves on these sculpts is hourglasses. I don't enjoy painting them. I don't know why. So here, I almost just left it copper. I'm like, well, I can't do that. So I'm painting the glass globe bits Fenrisian gray. So there's sort of glass looking-ish. And then demonstrating incredible technique, I add a Nuln Oil gloss because it's glass. And that's about as much effort as I put into it. Moving right along, I grab Rise of Rust and I just very lightly stipple it against some of that dark rust that I pooled earlier. Just want a tiny bit of brighter rust in a few spots. In case it's interesting, I use Dark Earth Vallejo paste. When that's dry, you can see how I applied it here. Once it's dry brush it with XV88 and then dry brush it with Karak Stone, and then add a couple tufts to your liking. Here's a look at the finished Spirit Torment, who goes by Crawlocke The Jailor for no reason in particular. Hope you found this video tutorial helpful. Sorry the editing hasn't been my greatest work. Please consider sharing the video, liking, and subscribing, and follow me on social media for interesting tidbits and whip and whatnot. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.